To those who did not actively follow the ebb and flow of the railroad industry in the mid-1950s, the end of the steam locomotive happened quietly in the background of day-to-day business. Over time, however, a sense of whatever happened to those began to grow, and seeing a steam locomotive again began to produce a sense of nostalgia. It was then that railroads and groups began to bring a handful of locomotives back for special excursions. One of the many pioneering excursion programs took place on one of Pennsylvania's major railroads. The Reading Company's T1 class locomotives were the railroad's war babies. While mostly new construction, some parts and boiler sections from older consolidation-type locomotives were used so that the Reading could call these engines rebuilds and get through the War Production Board's red tape. The T1s were the Reading's fast freight engines and were assigned to just about every sort of freight train the Reading could offer up. The T1s received mixed reviews from Reading crews and had a couple of mechanical weak points. Although the class was removed from regular service in 1954, they were stored serviceable and reactivated as traffic demanded for a couple more years. 8 of them were leased to the Pennsylvania Railroad to help alleviate a motive power crunch on the standard railroad of the world. The T1s were the newest steam locomotives on the Reading Railroad, so the company still kept a number in reserve even after the use of steam locomotives officially ended on the Reading in 1956. The Reading Company, like many other railroads at the time, was happy to run chartered passenger excursion trains for railfans every now and then. In 1958, such a trip was run from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to the Reading's shops in Reading, Pennsylvania. A major attraction for many of the passengers during the layover in Reading was the line of stored T1 steam locomotives sitting near the shop complex. This did not go unnoticed by railroad staff. Many of the T1s still had flue time and could be reactivated fairly easily. With the rebounding interest in steam locomotives at the time, the Reading Company elected to set a few of the T1s aside and run steam fan trips as a publicity and goodwill campaign. T1s numbered 2100, 2101, 2123, and 2124 were stored separately from the rest of the mothballed fleet. 2123 was to be a parts source and remained in storage, as did 2100 and 2101, which were kept as backup power and for possible future operation. Number 2124 was put into service to pull the trips, soon to become famous as the Reading Company's Iron Horse Rambles. 2124 pulled the first Rambles trip on October 25, 1959. The train was brought from the Reading Terminal in Philadelphia by Diesels and handed over to 2124 at Wayne Junction. From there, the train traveled to Shamokin, Pennsylvania and back. 2 other Rambles also took place that year. The Reading pulled out all the stops to make the Rambles a success, and even consulted with their railfan unofficial historian of sorts, George Hart, for how to make the trips a better show. George planned spots for whistle and smoke shows, and amended his contract with the school he served as treasurer to allow him time off on days the Rambles were running. In December of 1959, number 2124 was hired for use in a movie. The crew making the motion picture From the Terrace, starring Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, and Myrna Loy, needed a scene of a steam-powered train arriving at the Reading Terminal for the opening of the film. The big T1 could not reach Reading Terminal due to clearance issues, so the scenes were shot in Jersey City. At the conclusion of the film shoot, 2124 was bedecked with a banner declaring her to be the biggest star of the year. 1960 saw the Iron Horse Rambles really begin to get into gear. 2124 pulled 11 trips to a variety of locations. Popular destinations for the Rambles included tours of the Gettysburg battlefield and the Reading shops. Although steam had been gone from the Reading for a few years, a lot of water towers and similar steam infrastructure still remained. This made the logistics of running the Rambles fairly simple, at least in terms of water supply. Turning facilities were becoming scarce, though, so sometimes 2124 had to be reversed long distances to stage her for a Rambles trip. This would happen for a number of trips through the years. Finding fitting passenger cars for the trips was no problem for the Reading, as most of their commuter train fleet had seen service with steam locomotives. These passenger cars would be taking commuters on the weekdays, be used for a ramble over a weekend, and go right back into the commuter pool on Monday. The fact that the Reading Railroad still had staff maintaining steam locomotives turned out to be a boon for another Pennsylvania railroad. During the summer of 1960, a little 060 was towed into the Reading shops for a little boiler work before being sent on to its final destination, Strasburg, Pennsylvania. 2124 was not the only T1 to see steam in 1960, however. One of the T1s left in reserve, 2102, was loaned to the Carpenter Steel Company to generate steam for their plant after a fire had taken their plant boilers offline. That being said, 8 other T1s still in reserve were deemed surplus to requirements and were scrapped that same year. In 1961, the Iron Horse Rambles reached their high point. 14 trips were run throughout the year. 2124's flue time was set to expire by November of 1961, so the Reading Company activated the original T1, number 2100, and assigned her to some of the trips. 2124 and 2100 double-headed a few excursions as well. There were a few steam locomotives still working at industrial sites at the time, and some of these operators abutted the Reading Company main line. Often, the crews at the industrial sites would make sure to bring their locomotives out to meet the passing Rambles trains and exchange whistle salutes with the T1s as they passed. Like most steam excursion trains, photo run-bys were also a part of the Iron Horse Rambles. The train would stop at a photogenic location, photographers and amateurs with handheld movie cameras would get off, the train would back up, then be run hard past the photographers with black smoke and plenty of whistle. While the Reading didn't invent the photo run-by, they certainly put on the best show they could for it. Twenty-one 24's last run took place on October 22, 1961, after which her flue time expired and she came due for an overhaul. She was placed into storage, and 2100 became the primary motive power for the Rambles. In 1962, 8 Rambles trips were operated. 2100 did not have to take the whole season solo, however, as in April of 1962, T1 number 2102 joined the Rambles roster. The pair double-headed a number of trips together. Fall foliage was a peak time for Rambles trips, and the T1s put on a show not soon to be forgotten. "1963 saw a private individual, a Mr. F. Nelson Blount, purchase number 2124 and move her to his Steamtown collection in Bellows Falls, Vermont. 8 more Rambles would be run by the Reading that year. However, running the Iron Horse Rambles and keeping the T1s running was getting costly for the Reading, which was beginning to feel a financial pinch as the post-war boom slowed and trucks began to take a bite out of freight traffic. The Reading Company announced that 1963 would be the last year for the Iron Horse Rambles. As they were gearing up for the last few trips, dry conditions had many local governments requesting that the Reading Company not run the steam engines to avert lineside fires. The T1s were sidelined, and diesels pulled the trips instead. The last ramble of 1963 was a trip to the Reading shops, where one of the T1s was pulled out and fired up for the passengers to see. For a moment, it looked like that would be the last gasp of the mighty T1. All fired up, but nowhere to go. The disappointment was palpable, so the leadership of the Reading Company decided to bring the Iron Horse Rambles back for one more year to send it off with a proper conclusion. 8 more rambles were run in 1964, with the final one featuring 2100 and 2102 doubleheading a trip from Philadelphia to Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. After that trip, the T1s returned to their home base, and the fires were dropped for the last time. The T1s were then placed back in storage. In 1965, T1's 2100, 2101, and 2102, as well as the Reading's 060 tank shop switcher number 1251, were sold. 2100 and 2101 would end up stored in a Baltimore scrapyard. 2102 was sold to Steam Tours Incorporated, and 1251 would be sold to George Hart's Rail Tours Incorporated. The story was not over for any of those T1s, however. 2101 would finally get a chance at the limelight in the mid-1970s when Ross Rowland acquired her for use on the American Freedom Train and Chessie Steam Special. 2100 would run again in the 1980s and change hands several times, including being sold to Richard Kuhn, then president of Lionel Trains, and later to Thomas Paine of Canada, under whose ownership she operated on a short-lived push-pull tourist train in Tacoma, Washington. The 2100 is currently in Cleveland, Ohio, where she is again being restored to running condition. Shortly after leaving the Reading, number 2102 began a long and varied career of mainline excursion trips everywhere from Michigan to Pennsylvania. In 1968, she was dressed as a Delaware and Hudson engine for the celebrations of their sesquicentennial. The 1970s saw her recreate a ramble and traverse horseshoe curves several times. She eventually made her way to the Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad, where she was sidelined in need of an overhaul in 1991. In January of 2016, the Reading and Northern steam crews began to look at what it would take to get 2102 to steam again. Andy Muller, owner of the Reading and Northern, greenlit the project, and 2102 returned to steam in 2022 after a $2.4 million overhaul. 2102 is currently in operation, pulling the Reading and Northern's own version of the Iron Horse Rambles, traversing some sections of track that the originals traveled more than 60 years ago. When someone mentions the Reading T1s, often the Freedom Train, Chessie Steam Special, or 2102's many trips come to mind. That being said, if the Reading Company had not seen a good reason to keep a handful of the T1s around into the mid-60s, it's not certain that any of them would have been around long enough to be purchased into the private ownership that launched them into those later grand adventures. It's worth keeping in mind where these big freight engines first tried their hand at pulling passenger excursions, rambling on the Reading.